In 2014, Americans used over 100 billion plastic bags. That's almost 200,000 a minute, and less than 10% of it was recycled. The other 90% ended up incinerated, or in landfills or the environment. This causes immense damage to ecosystems across the world, particularly to marine wildlife, and it doesn't just stay in the water. A recent study found that a quarter of all fish sold in supermarkets contain some plastic debris. As a whole, plastic bag use creates environmental, economic, and social problems, ranging from reduced soil drainage and cultural values to increased emissions and flooding, like in Los Angeles, where officials found that plastic bags were partially to blame for this flood in 2016. But in recent years, there's been some progress. A growing trend has seen cities and states across the country reducing their reliance on single-use bags by taxing consumers who still use them, or outright banning them altogether. Most recently, the state of New York passed Title VI, Part 351, the Bag Waste Reduction Law, a big win for environmentalists. It was set to take effect on March 1st, 2020. But then, things got complicated.
Health officials have announced they expect to see the coronavirus outbreak intensify.
First death from coronavirus here in the United States.
The total number of confirmed cases is now at more than 4,500.
43,000.
160,000.
2 million.
Where the CDC just issued a stark warning.
Department of Defense will be providing quarantine facilities if needed.
To protect the health of those shopping during the coronavirus.
Executive order allowing stores to use plastic bags.
One by one, these states and towns started to repeal their plastic bag bans on the basis that reusables could contribute to the spread of coronavirus. Lawmakers in Maine voted to delay their ban until next year. New Hampshire mandated that grocers can only bag store-provided single-use bags. And Massachusetts banned reusable bags in grocery stores altogether.
All regulations on plastic bag bans will be lifted.
And back in New York, before their bag ban could even be enforced, it was postponed. At first glance, these decisions sound understandable. It's a pandemic after all. But it turns out, they're not doing much at all, besides undoing a decade's worth of progress. On March 18th, the Plastics Industry Association wrote an open letter to Alex Azar, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. In it, they asked him to speak out against bans on single-use plastics and help stop the rush towards sustainable products like reusable bags. They cited studies that claimed show that reusable bags carry viruses and bacteria, and asserted that single-use plastics are often the safest choice. One of those studies was conducted by Ryan Sinclair.
I did those studies not for the plastics industry, that's for sure. I did it because, we can come up with new public health initiatives to kind of battle this problem. Reusable bags should be used as soon as possible, as soon as this pandemic curve starts going down. But the problem with them right now is just too much of an issue.
The worry is that by handling reusable bags, grocery store workers increase their risk of infection and ultimately increase the risk of transmitting it further. And that argument is certainly valid. But none of these studies moved to eradicate reusable bags, even though one of them was funded by the American Chemistry Council. They just concluded that it's good practice to wash them consistently, promoted in-store hygiene campaigns, and advocated for more research into antimicrobial treatments, which are promising. The problem with this research, though, is that it focuses mainly on bacteria.
The silver one works great. As far as gram-negative bacteria goes, actually, I haven't tested it for virus.
And the coronavirus is, well, a virus.
Okay, the main difference with the bacterial contaminant.
That's Chris Gill, an infectious disease specialist and associate professor of global health at Boston University.
Is that in the right environment, the bacteria can continue to replicate outside of a host, whereas a virus cannot. It has to be inside a cell before it makes more viruses. That's just their biology, whereas some bacteria can continue to grow.
That's exactly what these studies show, an increase in bacterial growth in control bags. But when treated with antimicrobial silver, a 99% decrease. But coronavirus isn't bacterial. It behaves differently, and it behaves differently on different surfaces too.
One was copper, one was cardboard, one was steel, and the fourth was plastic. Okay? And then they calculated the half-lives for each of these. Now, a half-life is a very simple concept. It's just it's an exponential decay curve, meaning that the half-life is how long it takes for whatever concentration you start with to reduce by 50%. The copper surface was very inhospitable to the virus. The half-life was about an hour, and so it doesn't last long. When they put it on cardboard, the half-life was quite a bit longer, but still fairly short. It was around 2 or 3 hours. So that's useful to know because like paper and cardboard is everywhere in our world.
Would reusable bags that are like made of composite, like cotton materials, be?
Right, they would be a good proxy for cardboard. When they went up to steel, now it's really long. It's like 7 hours. So if you could track that out, you would need maybe 2 or 3 days before you got to undetectable levels. And then the most accommodating of all was plastic.
Using cardboard as a proxy for reusable bags, it's possible that these materials pose a much smaller risk of transmitting coronavirus than, for instance, plastic bags do.
That's the one that wigs me out a little bit because plastic, like paper, is everywhere in our environment. And it gets right to your question about the plastic bags, because the plastic bags themselves could be contaminated with COVID-19 for a lot longer than your canvas tote bag that you brought into the store. So you kind of wonder, like, is this actually completely backwards logic?
And speaking of completely backwards, it's basic economics that single use doesn't make much sense to begin with. It's simply more cost effective to reuse. Plastic bags are often thought of as free, but that's just not the case. The plastics industry profits over $4 billion a year from single-use bag sales in the United States alone. And these costs are passed on to consumers, whether we realize it or not. With many reusables retailing for less than $1, the economic impact to a consumer is negligible for the first year after switching to reusables, but savings increase sharply thereafter. And at the same time, current tax incentives encourage shoppers to bring their own bags. And it works in places like DC, where a 5-cent fee resulted in an 80% drop in bag usage. And up in Maryland, these taxes aren't going anywhere, despite expectations to avoid reusables. This reinforces a conundrum where reusable bags are economically advantageous, but culturally and now legally frowned upon. And it's important to remember that these monetary costs are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole other side of environmental issues that have to be accounted for economically. Across the world, plastic bags represent a drastic threat to marine environments that hinders economic development by creating an aesthetic issue for tourism, damaging vessels, and transporting invasive species at a conservative cost of $13 billion a year. But the true environmental costs are difficult to monetize. Plastic bags that end up in the oceans endanger wildlife by entanglement, ingestion, and pollution. This causes suffocation, infection, and decreases reproductive success. That means that countries with coastal borders have an especially important role to play in limiting the effects of single-use plastics. And the good news is that around the year 2000, many countries started doing just that. But just when it seemed like more of these laws were starting to take root in North America, a place where policies for plastic bag interventions are lacking and occur infrequently, without agreement of neighboring regions, the plastics industry is using this pandemic as a reason to return to even more reliance on single-use plastics. And the worst part?
I generally sort of feel like we are probably focusing on the wrong problem. Basically, with respiratory diseases, we think of 3 ways that they move around, right?
The first is direct contact, or spread through bodily expulsions like coughing or sneezing too close to someone. The second is indirect spread, through touching common, inanimate surfaces known as fomites. This is the worry with reusable bags. The third route is known as aerosolized spread, and it deals with the droplets that you expel when you cough, sneeze, or even just talk. When they're expelled, most droplets are heavy enough to be pulled down to the ground almost immediately.
But as you kind of come down to very small droplets, like, a micron or less than a micron, which is about the size of a coronavirus, those tiny, tiny, tiny little droplets can actually remain suspended in the air, just kind of waft around. They're so light that, yes, gravity pulls them down, but any kind of like updraft of air keeps them swirling around, and they can swirl around for hours. To my mind, the first and the third routes, the direct sneeze and the aerosols, are far more concerning than the indirect route through the shopping bags.
I still think it's important to just minimize the number of these items that traverse from your public to private and then private to public spaces.
Right? So certainly reasonable to wash your hands or sterilize your hands before you go in and when you come out of the grocery store. I would do all of those things because there's no cost to that. But the bigger risk, I think, is if we're focusing all our attention on things like should we use canvas bags or plastic bags, we're missing the big gorilla in the back of the room, which is the air you're breathing in the supermarket, which is almost for sure the main reason that people are getting infected.
And during this pandemic, when many claim that the Earth is healing, we risk taking a huge step back in terms of being conscious about the single-use plastics that we consume. There might be reason to play it safe with reusable bags, but the measures that we should be taking aren't much different than what we should be doing when we're not in a pandemic. Let's look into more antiviral coatings for the long term. And in the meantime, wash reusable bags consistently. Bag them yourself in the store. And if they're truly not allowed inside, bag your groceries outside at your car. In uncertain times like these, everyone is searching for any semblance of control they can find. So, our ability to be responsible and green consumers shouldn't be put on the line.